Sanjucha, who's going to introduce our panel.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Melanie. JLF New York loves being at the Center for Fiction, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to request all of you to come up if you'd like to. I'm sure the speaker, Martin, would really like it to be able to see all of you. So we warmly welcome all of you this afternoon to this session. It's our 7th edition of JLF New York, and we're here at the Center for Fiction for the very first time. We're presenting now The Written Word, How Literature Shaped History. Martin Puchner, he'll be in conversation with Sanjoy Roy. Writer Martin Puchner's book, The Written Word, How Literature Shaped History, is a fascinating account of how great texts and technologies have shaped cultures, civilizations, and altered human history. In a captivating conversation, we hope, today with Sanjoy, Puchner will explore how literature is central to the development of religions, politics, and nations, while also playing a decisive role in how we view the world. Martin is the Byron and Anita Vine Professor at Harvard University. His prize-winning books range from philosophy to technology and the arts and include The Written Word, a WSJ bestseller that has been translated into 20 languages. His most recent book is Culture, the Story of Us, From Cave Art to K-Pop. Sanjoy Roy is the Managing Director of Teamwork Arts, which produces over 33 festivals in 42 cities and 17 countries, including the world's largest literary gathering, the Jaipur Literature Festival, and all the international editions of the JLF. This conversation will be followed by a Q&A. May I please invite on stage Martin and Sanjoy. I would request all of you to please, you're welcome to take photographs and tweet, tag, put it up on social media. All our tweet handles are right there for you to take a note of. I think Melanie's already conveyed this, but I'm going to reiterate that Martin's books are on sale. They'll be available outside, and he will be signing books after this session. The Written Word, How Literature Shaped History, Martin Puchner, in conversation with Sanjoy Roy. Over to you, Sanjoy.
Thank you so much, Sharupa, and welcome. The first time we sort of stumbled into the Center for Fiction, we were completely blown away by just how amazing this place was. The stacks of books, the way that they engaged with the local population, and both Suraj and I just felt it was very important for us to be here and bring JLF for the first time to Brooklyn. So we're absolutely delighted to partner with Melanie and her colleagues at Center for Fiction, and we do hope that over the years this particular room swells with the numbers of people from in and around this particular place. Our primary effort in New York has been not necessarily you come to us, but can we bring some amazing work to you? And it's really in that context that we thought that it would be wonderful to get Martin. For those of you who don't know, The Written Word is a book that should be in every one of your libraries. I've known Martin for some time. He's been coming out to the Jaipur Literature Festival. But this book opens your eyes and your mind to what we think we know, the power of the word or the power of literature. But when you read this, you actually realize how much of the world that we know today has been shaped by words. So Martin, over to you to do a quick presentation and take us through 3,000 years of history of the written word, and then we'll have a conversation and open it up for questions.
Thanks so much, and thanks for having me. I used to live around here before this wonderful place emerged. I think I left in 2018, so it's great to be back and to see what happened in my absence. So, you know, this project and the ones following, including culture, that was just mentioned, really started with a dilemma. So about 15 years ago, I sort of stumbled into the job of editing a huge world literature anthology, the Norton Anthology of World Literature, that was to go from the beginning of writing all the way to the present in like 6 volumes. And I thought, with a large team of people, and we all totally freaked out, because I think each of us thought that, oh yeah, we're well read, we've read all kinds of literature, and being confronted with those sort of 4,000 years of literature, we just realized how much literature existed, how little we knew. And so we and I started to sort of go back to the basics. I read a lot of books on world history, and that's sort of an established genre. There are sort of more popular ones and more scholarly ones, and then I was looking for similar books of world literature and realized that for some reason, and I have some thoughts about that, they just didn't exist. And so, my team and I, we just, over many years of putting together that anthology, we started to create that bigger picture, and we realized that it was only once we've created that bigger picture that we could ask and answer some of the most fundamental questions about literature, such as why and when was writing first invented? How often was writing invented? I had no idea how even to answer that question. My answer is, by the way, at least twice, and that itself is an interesting story. What is the big shape of literary history in different parts of the world, and what's the role of technology, since we were all, writing and reading and thinking about literature in the context of a media revolution. So in some sense, that work with that wonderful team of people, and it's an ongoing effort, first sort of put me in that position of developing sort of a bird's eye view of literature and look at some of these broader patterns. And so I tried to, my first attempt to describe that is this book, and then basically I've been working on this project on that perspective ever since.
So Martin, you talk about inventing literature, or 2 stories, and you talk about it in the book. Will you tell us how these 2 stories came about? Because they were really 2 parts of the world. But before that, so what comes first? Art, right?
Well, unfortunately, no. Writing was invented in Mesopotamia about 5,000 years ago. So this was the beginning of urban civilizations, the first cities in southern Iraq. And because of that urbanization, that concentration of people, there were more and more complex economic transactions. And that's really when writing was invented, to keep track of these economic transactions. So in some sense, writing was invented by accountants. And it was—
Wall Street always prevailed.
It's sad, but it's true. And then only hundreds of years later, sort of as a byproduct, people started to write down stories. So yeah, that was a big surprise for me.
And the inventing of the writing and the 2 different stories you alluded to?
So that's, and then you can start, so this is the earliest full existing alphabet in Mesopotamia, cuneiform, written on clay tablets in what's today southern Iraq. And then there are, of course, other early writing cultures, Egypt, India, Greece, China. But they're all they're all connected on the European and Asian, on the Eurasian continent. So it's possible that some of these inventions were independent inventions, but it's also possible that they sort of traveled by idea transfer. From the writing systems themselves are quite different, but that the idea of writing was invented only once in Mesopotamia. So that was the question. Was this just sort of this one-time fluke, some crazy accountant coming up with this idea and changing the history of the world? But then the interesting thing is that there is one certain second invention, and that's in the Americas. That's the Maya, the Maya culture. There was relatively little writing in the Americas before the arrivals of the Spaniards, but there was the Mayan and Mesoamerica in general, several writing traditions there. There was a kind of writing in Peru, and the Aztecs had sort of picture books and a kind of picture writing. So there were various writing traditions, but the only full-blown alphabet really came out of the Mayan tradition, and there are 1,500 years of Maya literature, and it's a fascinating. It's almost like a control experiment where you can say, okay, now we actually have a second completely independent invention of writing, and we can observe how literary history proceeded prior to the connecting of these two writing cultures. And so I just find that fascinating. And the Maya tradition, including the great epic Popol Vuh, which itself has a fascinating history, I think is completely understudied and known only by experts for the most part. But it's the only definitely authentically, independent writing tradition, and that is kind of cool.
What was amazing in your book is to see that the way that the Mayan culture, the writing came to us, is again by somebody who conquered and decided then to write up or translate this, and then use the translation later to sort of subjugate the people. But tell us about the story.
Well, of course, that contact, as I think everyone here knows, was maximally destructive. The Spaniards, they arrive.
With chickenpox.
Well, among other things, right? They arrive as conquerors, but they also bring inadvertently, for the most part, diseases against which the populations of the Americas are not immune. But that's not the only destruction. They're also very, they're deliberate acts, and so. Though they're Christians, so they do want to preserve souls, they want to convert. But then they realize that Mayas stick to, in some sense, they convert to Christianity, but they hold on to their old gods at the same time in a polytheistic world. That's not a problem. And so the Spaniards realize that they convince themselves that they have to eradicate Maya culture by the root, and the root in their mind, and maybe rightly so, is the Maya writing culture. So they try to round up all the books, destroy all the books, and basically
they do this huge bonfire. Where all the books are brought in and burnt, and some people sort of hide the books underground. But most of them are.
Exactly. It's a massive act of cultural sabotage and destruction. And the only reason why this great text, the Popol Vuh, survives, and I find it's an incredibly moving and amazing story, is that these three anonymous Maya scribes, they realize that their culture is under assault, that they realize that it will be eradicated. They realize that their writing system will disappear and become illegible. So what they do is they write down the text, the council book, their sacred text, the Popol Vuh, in the alphabet of the victors, grudgingly, but realizing that that's the only way this text will survive, and they hide this book. And this is how the Popol Vuh survives, by the savvy of these anonymous scribes. And it's only really over the course of the 20th century that the Mayan glyphs are sort of rediscovered and deciphered again.
And the first scribe was Moses?
Well, it's, according to the Hebrew Bible, he's the first scribe.
Because God wrote the first few tablets, and
Right. Well, that's the scene on Mount Sinai, the writing of the Ten Commandments. It's a fascinating scene. I mean, I must have, heard.
Not the Cecil DeMille scene, but this is the maybe.
I mean, it's a crazy scene, because first Moses writes the Ten Commandments himself with his hand on stone, and then it's the famous scene where dance around the golden calf. He gets angry, breaks the tablets, and then Moses. And then we have the second writing of the Ten Commandments, and now it's Moses who writes, taking dictation from God. It's a very odd sort of double writing, and then Moses is seen as the author of the 5 books of Moses, as they're called, though that's a historical fiction. That's a backdating of that. But that writing scene is fascinating. Yeah.
And the scribes, the way that you tell your story, scribes through the ages are the ones who hold the power.
Yes.
Because they can write what their kings or their emperors are saying. but they can also divine and in many ways dictate
Yes.
what their kings and
Yes.
emperors could or should
Yes.
have been saying.
It's very true, and that divination is very
Sort of Biden's speechwriter type of person.
Exactly. No, I think that's true. You know, there's this amazing story that Mesopotamian scribes, the ones who invented writing, these accountant scribes, told themselves and wrote down about the invention of writing, and it's a really fascinating and very telling story. It takes place in Uruk. There's a king of Uruk. Uruk is the first city. It's the place where the first longer text of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is set. King Gilgamesh is a king of Uruk. Actually, a year ago, I was finally able to go to Uruk in southern Iraq, and it was fascinating to see, among other things, but this is sort of a sidebar, the Epic of Gilgamesh is, to my mind, I've become more and more convinced of it, a key to understanding climate change, because it records deforestation, which goes hand in hand with the first city building, and that's when we get the story of the flood and the whole sort of apocalyptic imaginary of climate change. But in any case, so the story is set in Uruk, and it features a king of Uruk who wants to conquer the mountain realm of Arata. And so the king of Uruk sends a messenger into the mountains demanding, allegiance of the king of the mountain king. But the mountain king is not impressed, sends the messenger back with a taunt and refuses to submit. And so the back and forth it goes, this diplomatic standoff. The messenger runs back and forth. And finally, when he returns one more time with a negative reply, this mountain realm is still, not ready to pledge allegiance, the king of Uruk gets incredibly mad and lets out this rant, and the scribe, the messenger standing next to him panics because he can't remember this long rant. And it's at this moment in the story that the king takes some clay and puts his words to clay, gives the clay tablet to the messenger runs one more time up into the mountains, shows the king of the mountain realm this message, and the mountain king doesn't understand how it's possible that words could be on this piece of clay, and then in front of the whole court is so impressed by this piece, this handheld piece of technology, that he submits. And so that's the story these scribes themselves told about this invention, and you can tell it's about power. It's about expanding the reach of these city-states from one place to the next, and it has nothing to do with literature. It's about empire, if you will. No.
What's been fascinating again is that through history or through millennia, the story of the flood, the Gilgamesh story of the flood, gets repeated, whether it's in the Noah's Ark, whether it's in the Indian traditional myth-telling stories. So is it that all of these people received inspiration from each other? Did the stories travel? Or were they all separately telling this one big story of the planet and the Great Flood?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure. I think there are flood stories in many different traditions. What's amazing is that this particular flood story that appears first in Gilgamesh, and then in the Hebrew Bible, and then in the Old Testament, and then in the Quran, is clearly the same story. So it's very clear. It has the Noah character in the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's Utnapishtim, who is the only one who understands what's going to happen. There's a sense of punishment that humans have sinned, and they're going to be punished by this flood. But the one savvy or righteous person is going to save us. And so all the details are the same. So that one flood story certainly spread and became incredibly influential, and there are theories that this may be based on the historical event when the Mediterranean Sea connected with the Black Sea, and so that was sort of a sudden flooding of the Near East, and that's where the story of the flood sort of originates.
And you didn't find any such evidence in the Americas of a similar story, either in the Mayan culture or in the First Nation Americans?
So I don't, not in that form. There are stories of flooding. So there's the Aztecs live in Tenochtitlan, which is Mexico City, which is in the middle of a lake, and there are stories of flooding, but that's a very different situation. It's because it has to do with water management and canals. It's an incredibly complicated ecosystem, how that world works, and they built a new aqueduct, and that it all floods. So that's the one flood story from the Aztecs I can remember. But I think there are some stories involving flooding in the in the upper west coast of the United States. There are other flood stories.
So are those Inuit recorded
Yes,
stories?
exactly. So there are other flood stories that are not that particular story, that Gilgamesh, Hebrew Bible, Quran story, yeah.
How many of you know 1001 Arabian Night stories, Shahzadeh, everybody? Roughly when was it written? Any guesses? Anybody? A guess?
1,000 years ago.
1,000 years ago. Why don't you tell us when exactly it was put to paper?
That's such a mean question, because it's a trick question. This is not the first trick question you've asked me, so I think I think 1,000 years ago it's not a bad theory. The reason why it's a trick question is that because it's actually impossible to say, because it's a story collection that's based on tons of oral stories and oral storytelling traditions, and oral stories that actually moved from one written frame tale collection. You know, there are these incredible South Asian story collections, or even story collections of story collections.
The Jatakas and the Panchatatra.
Exactly, and many others. And so it's fascinating to see that there was basically sort of a network of stories, and some of these stories sort of travel from one place to another and sort of get repackaged. This particular package was put together first in Baghdad, based on Persian and South Asian sources, powered by the arrival of paper from China. So that's the sort of technology story where the paper suddenly made writing much cheaper, and that arrival of paper, a Chinese invention, really powered the golden age of Arabic letters and made writing more popular, more widespread, which is why these more popular tales of the 1001 Nights were written down for the first time. And then they started to travel from there finally via Al-Andalus into Europe, and much later started to be translated into European languages, including French.
And got to the French court.
And got to the French court, and they became so popular that the French public wanted more and more stories, more and more episodes, and the translator ran out of episodes, and people were literally like, throwing stones against his window. So he teamed up with a young Syrian storyteller, and they just added new stories. And some of the most well-known ones of the Arabian Nights, like Ali Baba, they're from that new edition. So they are also based on Arabic story traditions, but this young Syrian storyteller just sort of combined them and added to them. So that's what I find fascinating. There isn't sort of one source text. It keeps evolving, and that's in the spirit of that oral storytelling tradition.
What's fascinating is this young boy, sort of the big exotic thing in the French court, brought by this person who wanted to make an impression in the French court with the princesses and the queen, and they conjure up all of these sort of season 1, season 2, season 10.
It's like a story out of the Arabian Nights,
Quite amazing. I'm having to race through 3,000 years of writing, so bear with me. Gutenberg. Gutenberg, in many ways, sort of did what you do when you go to church and sit outside and confess your sins. but he gave you a certificate, right? Which sort of erased all yours. It's like in India, if you go and take a dip in the Ganges,
Yes.
you know, you're done. You know, you can go back and do another 1,000 years of sin. So Gutenberg basically sort of took one of these things and.
He did. I mean, you're referring to indulgences, right? What the Catholic Church sold against money. It's like money.
A certificate to sort of pay for
your sins.
Yeah.
Right, and that's how they raised money to build churches, including St. Peter in Rome. And this is why the indulgences sort of proliferated. And Gutenberg, who just assembled the first kind of
press,
reinvented the press. We'll talk about that myth that he invented print in a second, maybe. But he certainly realized that that's a great. It's like printing money. You can use the same certificate and you know, print it 1,000 times or 10,000 times, and he sort of flooded the market with them. That was the beginning of print. It's printing money essentially.
And he also then challenged the church. Here he was, you know, selling these indulgences, which is really like a certificate. You know, you volunteer, here's a certificate. You sin, here's a certificate, and you know, you're not sinning.
You are accepting these certificates, right, to support the festival?
And also, exactly, yeah, we give receipts, similar kind of stuff. But he then challenged the church, and the church owned the right to write the Bible.
You know, it's interesting. I'm not sure I would use the word challenge, because he convinced the church to let him print Bibles. That's the first long book
in black and red.
And the church, of course, loved these handwritten Bibles, but they were very expensive to produce. And so we're talking about the Bible in Latin. So his proposition was, his value proposition, as we say today, was that he could the same thing, more beautiful, more symmetrical, for cheaper. And so this was his first market, Latin Bible, huge, heavy Latin Bibles for, you know, private people wouldn't buy them for monasteries and convents and churches. That was his first market, and the church initially thought, that's great for us. We are in control of this foundational text, the sacred text. The more, the merrier. This is Latin, so the unwashed masses won't, you know, get access to it anyway. But we can supply our churches and our priests with these Bibles, and so that's how it started.
And how did the democratization of access to this kind of literature, what happened? How did that evolve?
Well, it evolved really when people started to translate the Bible and print the Bible in the languages that people could actually understand, like English and German, and that's really the beginning of the Protestant Revolution. So it's sort of a story where the church in the beginning thought, this new technology is going to work for us. It's gonna you know, support our power over this text. But then it got away from them through these translations, suddenly everyone was able to purchase, or not everyone, but more people were able to purchase translations of the Bible. They were first, you know, they were outlawed, especially in England, but you couldn't control this process anymore. So at first the church thought, we can control this, and then it worked against them.
It's like every government thinks that they can.
Yes.
And then Luther comes in to the picture.
Exactly.
And he sort of says, cocks a snook at them and says, hey.
Exactly. And he, at first, you know, he was just an unworldly monk, and he, you know,
was he an anarchist sort of?
I don't think he was an anarchist. He was just upset about the indulgences and about certain hierarchy, you know, the hierarchical church. But he wrote this, you know, his theses were a letter he wrote in Latin to his bishop. So, you know, he followed the chain of command. He wrote in Latin. And then it was really when some of his friends and associates said, you know, maybe we should, you know, translate this into German and print it. And that's when that revolution started. And then it went from there, and Luther became 1/3 of all printed matter at that time in Germany were works by him. He dominated that early moment of print, and the church, you know, was on the.
And who benefited from Luther's?
Who benefited from Luther? I mean, that's a very complicated story. I mean, you could say that, you know, the church had it coming. It was this incredibly hierarchical institution. You could also describe these days Luther as sort of the first populist, and people now often make that, I think rightly, that connection to our internet, where there was an incredible proliferation of what we would call fake news and crazy stories, and it led to incredible wars in Europe, hundreds of years of wars. So it's a somewhat ambiguous legacy, but at the same time, for us, it's also clearly a democratization of writing. It started a virtuous cycle of literacy, where more and more people were able to read and write, and therefore were able to, different forms of literature emerged, different voices entered the literary world, and it just changed everything in the way that continues today with the internet. So it's an ambiguous thing, but in the end, I mean, a lot of people benefited, as a lot of people suffered from it. It's history. It's complicated.
And moving forward and going back to Europe, I mean, the first rights issue, the person who sort of protested about his work being copied was Don Quixote, was Cervantes.
Yes. It's fascinating. I mean, Don Quixote, takes on, I mean, he's a playwright, he's a sailor, he's a fascinating figure. And
he's also an accountant, and he does some fraud. He gets
yes.
thrown into jail pretty often, which is where he thinks up his book.
It's true, there's more accountants in this book than I realized. I didn't quite realize that. That's a very good point. In any case, so he writes the first part of Don Quixote and becomes this bestseller, and immediately there are no copyright protections. There are these unauthorized printings of it, and then someone else starts to write a sequel, and Don Quixote, Cervantes doesn't know what to do. He can't stop it, so he decides to write his own sequel, and in that sequel he sends his hero Don Quixote into a print shop where that unauthorized sequel is being printed, and sort of rail against that new technology of print and that there are no protections.
But his book, unlike ChatGPT perhaps, his book is really amazing, and people realize that this is the original, and that was ChatGPT.
That's true. It's true. It's true.
Coming to America and your great sort of Declaration of Independence, which was such a seminal piece of literature here. Tell us a little bit about that.
Especially now when I look back, it fits into this pattern that I saw, what I call foundational texts, that out of this weird accounting invention emerge these texts that are sometimes epics, sometimes poetry collection in the case of the Chinese tradition, or sacred texts that emerge out of this first writing revolution, and then these texts become these touchstones for entire cultures, and especially, and among other things, completely change our sense of religion, to the extent that today I think it's very hard to imagine even a religion in the narrow sense without sacred scripture. But that's a crazy connection in some sense, that somehow religion and this accounting technology would become completely intertwined. All world religions today have some form of sacred scripture to back it up. And that's kind of a weird thing once you look at it. And so I started to think about that, and also the negatives. I mean, in a way, I'm of course sort of a partisan of literature, and I think it's amazing, but you also see the negative sides of these foundational texts, where emerges something that I call textual fundamentalism, and you can see that in a religious sense, but you also see that in a political sense, because the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are sort of secular sacred texts. You have sort of special priests appointed for life who preside over the interpretation of this text. In the Supreme Court, you have an entire country, and both in a good and a bad sense. So for me, that's one of the big takeaways, both from the Declaration of Independence, but also all these other foundational texts, that it's really, that we live in a world very profoundly shaped by these foundational sacred or canonical texts, and that is an ambivalent thing, and that we need to figure out how to deal with that, how to allow flexible forms of interpretation, how to make sure that we don't have sort of always a class of priests who control the process, who control these texts. And so, yeah, I still haven't come down to sort of one solution. I don't think there is one, but it is that pattern that for the last 4,000 years, and increasingly so, we have lived in this world shaped by these foundational texts, religious, secular, and everything in between.
So in your research, where did you see the myth becoming history? For example, back home, Ramayana and the Mahabharata,
Yes.
for example, which are foundational texts for us,
yes.
but pretty much set in the field of mythology,
Yes.
is now seen as history.
Yes.
So what
Yeah.
how does that work? Where's the bridge?
No, I mean, I think that's a great point, and I think all of these foundational texts are myths in some sense, and then it's a question of how. I think that this is another way of describing textual fundamentalism, to saying this is how it was, and I'm in control of this narrative, and I'm going to tell you what this history is and how to read it and how to understand it, and it's all locked in. It's an attempt to control the narrative, and because the narrative is often a written text, to control the written text. And I think that's what we are up against.
And what's the difference? I mean, will the 10 seasons of Friends 200 years later be seen to be a foundational text?
It remains to be seen.
What's the difference? I mean,
well, I don't think. I mean, the difference in a way is history. That these were sort of early adopters. These are the first texts, and they have, people return to them in one way or retell these stories, and you of course you can say there's something amazing about them, or there's something that in there that explains a lot of things, that satisfies a desire to know, where we come from and why we're here, and provide some kind of a moral code to live by. So, I'm just bouncing that question back, whether that's also true of some of the great contemporary works that you just mentioned.
Sure. but in many ways, if you look at, in the Indian context, if you look at a Panchatantra or a Jataka tales, which is really fables in every sense
Animal
of the
fables.
word, animal fable, animistic fables, in a way, they didn't become foundational. They became stuff that you could borrow from, because they were so easy to borrow from. But they didn't become a foundational text. So say like Gilgamesh or the Ramayana.
It's true, and it's interesting because in a way they are tales where they're sort of framed where these pre-existing story materials get used by Buddhist traditions, and sort of the Buddha is sort of writing himself into these stories. No, it is different. There is, when I think about how do texts or how do cultural artifacts become foundational, I think of that. There's a fantastic play by the contemporary American playwright Anne Washburn called Mr. Burns. Do you know it? I think it's so great, and so it's a post-apocalyptic play in which after the apocalypse there are people who are trying to remember a Simpsons episode with Mr. Burns, and then 100 years later. There are longer stories out of that Simpsons episode, and they're traveling players like at Shakespeare's time, and then finally, 200 or 300 years, I haven't read it in a while, it becomes a religion. And you can see that just out of an attempt of a group of people to reconstruct a pre-apocalyptic Simpsons episode, you can create an entire culture. And I think in some sense, it's an incredible play. And I think it sort of nails that process. And I'm convinced. So I don't think it's necessary, even though I just said it sort of is. In the end, I don't think it's an inherent quality. It's just you can give humans any kind of bit of culture, and then they will create something out of it.
Would George Orwell's 1984 become a foundational text, given that what he wrote is something that we're seeing happen across the world?
I mean...
Or 2001 Space Odyssey.
It's a good question. I mean, it's too early to tell. I think with Orwell, since it's such a polemical text and it's written a text sort of written with a particular concern, it's a little hard to imagine that completely changing contexts. But if there's anything you can learn from literary history, is that out of a need of a cultural moment, you can do almost anything with a text. So I suppose they could. You keep wanting me to predict which text will be a foundational text.
It's interesting because when you sit in today's day and age, as perhaps the writers did then, look at Luther.
Yes.
He did a letter, not necessarily thinking that the letter would then lead to a whole movement,
right.
The Lutheran movement.
Yes.
It was an accident in construction. It wasn't an intent.
Absolutely.
And in the same way, perhaps the first episodes of Friends was an accident. Will it work?
Yeah.
It's like when you go to a studio, will it work? And it's so difficult to, and everybody wants to create the next Friends.
Yes, but it's hard to do. It's hard to engineer. There are so many externalities, I suppose.
But coming back to America and going back in time, Franklin sort of cracked the code. He realized that it wasn't just about the declaration and this piece of document, but it was about how do you get the document from place A to place B and the postal system. So
absolutely. It's interesting. Franklin's so invested as a writer in certain views, but then I think he does something that makes him much closer to someone like Steve Jobs or something like that, because he starts to realize that he wants to own the network. So he creates newspapers, not just
You mean Zuckerberg rather than Steve Jobs?
Maybe Zuckerberg is maybe the better example. You're right. He creates newspapers. He owns newspapers. At the beginning, people thought, we only need one newspaper. Why would you need several newspapers? He realized, you can have several newspapers. But he doesn't just want to own the newspaper. He wants to own paper. So he starts paper mills. And then he wants to control the distribution. So he becomes postmaster general. So he can send his newspapers for free from Philadelphia to New York. It takes one day. I think it takes more today to send a letter from Philadelphia to New York. So anyway, this is what he really cares about. And he doesn't push his political agenda. He allows all kinds of views, including crackpot views. And when he writes under pseudonym. So it's very interesting. He's much more interested in creating the infrastructure. And that's sort of his genius.
It's a fascinating story how he looks at this also as profit. And at one point of time, he's told that the journey from Philadelphia down to Washington and New York is really problematic and there's no rest houses. So he goes out there and he sort of sorts it all out. He sorts out the way that, a letter goes from place A to B. But, I'm going to open it up shortly, but let's go back to how was paper and printing and all of that invented. China, a different story in Arabia, in Babylon. Tell us both of this.
No, it's one of these myths. I'm not the first one to point it out, but Gutenberg is still seen as sort of the inventor of the printing press, and it's just not true. Both paper and print. And one of the big surprises for me was, as I already mentioned, that paper was at least as important as print, and more importantly, they're important together, because a printing technology only is effective or develops its own potential if you have a cheap material. And so they are both invented in China hundreds of years before Gutenberg, and then something very interesting happens in that these two inventions, which very much go hand in hand and do in China, sort of separate. Paper, the knowledge of paper moves to the Arabic world, where, as I said, it sort of powers the golden age of Arabic letters, and then moves into Europe via the Arab part of Spain, Al-Andalus, and arrives in Northern Europe, just in time when the idea of print, probably it's harder to reconstruct, probably arrives via land route, via the Silk Road. in Northern Europe. And so in a sense, these two inventions reconnect in Northern Europe. And this is what Gutenberg does. And so Gutenberg doesn't invent print. He certainly doesn't invent paper, but he recognizes a potential. And he basically sets up the first sort of assembly belt mass production. He realizes there's something about mass production. And that's really
and setting the letters and casting the letters and the thousands of people that he had to be able to keep up with the what's it called? The certificates?
The indulgences. I like certificates.
China, staying with China for a second, I mean, again, it was the scribes and the bureaucracy in China that dominated through millennia. Till very recently, where the same exam is done if you want to become a bureaucrat.
So you could call them scribes. In China, I mean, in English, translating a Chinese term, they're called literati, but it's interesting because it was, in a sense, the first system of meritocracy that was set up, in some ways to break the power of the military. So this exam system, which is sort of the origin of the SAT and all these, testing regimes, started in China like over 1,000 years ago and was meant to recruit bureaucrats. So your favorite accountants again, and so that's what happened. So this is a very interesting system where suddenly power accrued to those who knew literature and as a canon of foundational texts, and that's why the literati class became such an important and influential one over a very long period of time until the end of the 19th century.
And they held the power. And pushing back against this whole industrialization in many ways was Karl Marx. Drinking, in a pub and discuss, no, it was in a club.
He was playing a nice game called chess.
Chess, yeah.
And so, I mean, this is part of the populist potential of print, and I have a chapter on the Communist Manifesto. It's a text I had done previously research on, just because it's so interesting how that one text became so dominant, because there are dozens, hundreds of pamphlets like that were published in the middle of the 19th century. So why did that one text start to dominate and become very important very quickly, changing history for better or for worse? And so that, I think one reason was storytelling, because Marx and Engels didn't just put down a series of theses. They tell a big grand story of world history. That's how the Communist Manifesto starts. The history of the world is the history of class struggle, and then they tell the history of the world through that lens. And then add to it this new protagonist. They invent a new protagonist, the proletariat, a kind of collective protagonist in world history. They kind of conjure that protagonist into being, saying, these disempowered workers, they aren't just victims. They are protagonists in this history. So it was a completely new way of telling the story, and I think that's part of the appeal of that text. But I really feel like we should let the audience ask some questions.
One last thing before we, we're going off to Houston and later in December, Florida, the two states that ban the maximum number of books. Why does literature and the word threaten people in power?
I mean, in some ways, book banning and book disruption, I mean, it's one of the sort of subterranean through lines of this book too. I mean, I guess in an indirect way, in perverse way, it attests to the power of literature, that people recognize that power and want to control it, whether by creating institutions of interpretation, a priestly class or some set of group that controls interpretation, or through censorship and destruction. And I mentioned, of course, what the Spanish did in the New World, but that's just one of many examples. So there's a history of censorship and control that runs through the entire history of literature, and literature isn't always on the side of the oppressed, so to speak. We kind of think that since the 19th century, the writer is the writer, telling truth to power for the long, and that's true and very moving. But for the most of its history, literature was created, and written by scribes and accountants and those in power. So there's a very ambiguous and sort of our idea of the writer and the intellectual is very important. It's a very recent invention, which is interesting. But that's how it would frame the history of censorship, and it's disturbing to see it happening in front of our very eyes. But that ultimately, this is what it says, that this is important, so people fight over.
Romeo and Juliet was recently banned, as you know, I think in Texas or Florida, I can't remember where, as is the Diary of Anne Frank and Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale. And in many ways, in platforms like this, one of the important things is to look at all of the different truths that can coexist and stand together. Yeah. Martin, thank you for this, totally brilliant. Distilled in these pages is really, like I said, 3,000 or 5,000 years of history that you can pick and choose at your own time. But questions from the audience? Anybody? Yep.
I find it fascinating. We think of accountants as the most.
Can we just wait for the mic because these are all recorded? Thank you.
We imagine accountants to be the most boring people out there, but then you say that, what we know of the origin of the written word begins with the accountants, and you call that literature. So my question is, how do you define literature? In my mind, it has always been fiction, but clearly you cover, something like the Declaration of Independence or history, philosophy. How do you define literature?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and one I grappled with a lot. One of the difficulties with a term like fiction is it's a very recent term. This idea of literature as fiction of a certain sort of status or importance in some sense is only a few hundred years old. So you're always, in some sense, if you're trying to take a kind of bird's eye view of these things, you're in some ways always is the danger of taking a rather recent term and sort of projecting it back, and then you have difficulties, for example, looking at these epics. Are they fiction? Are they fact? Are they wisdom literature? Are they philosophy? What happens when they become sacred texts for certain communities? And so you have this sort of family of terms that we use to make distinctions that weren't necessarily used at the time. So this is why I decided, in some sense, to cast the net very broadly. There are certain things I don't really consider part of the purview, because I do think a storytelling element is sort of the driving force of it. So a pure code of laws, for example, is not something that I would consider literature in the broader sense. But if it's part of a larger text or a larger framing, as in the Hebrew Bible and many other texts, then I think that qualifies. So but you're absolutely right. In today, if you go to a bookstore and look at the way in which literature is classified, although it's also interesting that in some bookstores, I actually haven't checked. It's one of the first things I do is check how people classify literature, and sometimes it's fiction, or sometimes fiction is distinguished from classics or from literature, which is older fiction, and how the genre question, how is poetry or drama labeled, how is nonfiction and fiction, and so these classifications, I guess, change over time, as everything, and so it's very hard. You're sort of caught in a difficult place, because you either apply these current distinctions, and then you try to look for the equivalent, a few hundred years or a few thousand years ago, or you have to kind of cast the net more widely. And because that was sort of the exercise I was doing, that was my strategy. But it's an excellent question, and there is no neat solution in some sense.
Would you sort of label the Old Testament as fiction and the New Testament as nonfiction?
Oh, I literally think that these terms, fiction and nonfiction, just don't make sense in that. I think they would not have made sense to anyone at the time. So I really don't think that, you could start to, for example, look at certain, Greek historians, where they try to distinguish, or, if I go in the Sanskrit tradition to something like the Nyaya Sutra, which is very interested in truth and falsehood and fake news and what is required for something to be true. So I think there are, in many traditions, there is a certain stage that's reached where suddenly this question of the imagination and facts, or of history, or of logic and falsehood emerges, but it tends to emerge later in a tradition, not at the beginning, not when these foundational texts first emerge.
Yeah, there, and then Asha, and then at the back.
Thanks, Martin, for putting all of this complexity in such a simple form. You talked about textual fundamentalism, and a lot of the key lies in those who claim to be interpreters. And given human beings' history of leaning towards fundamentalistic interpretation versus not, how do you see the narrative evolving, if at all?
I mean, in some ways, and maybe that's I don't know whether it's depressing or not, I don't really see it evolving. I mean, I think in some sense we are, for better or worse, stuck. I guess that's a negative way of describing. We live in that world. We have been living in that world, and because writing has spread, and it's been incredibly democratized. So of course, many more people have access to texts and can interpret them. But the fight and control over these interpretations and these texts has not gone away, and I have not seen a waning of their influence. And so that's, for me, that was one of the surprising things, that something like the idea that certain texts are sacred, it's in some sense the most natural thing. No one here is surprised by that, but it's an idea that had to emerge at some point, and it emerged in different cultures. It emerged in the Mayan culture, the great control experiment. So it seems to sort of come along with this technology of writing and be sort of part and parcel of it. And since then, we have been living with this dilemma, and I think we still do. And it's interesting that all the democratizing effects of mostly these technologies, paper, print, the internet, have not changed that fundamental dynamic. So that's, in some sense, the most surprising thing for me.
Hi, my name is Asha. I was just, wondering if in your book, and I haven't read it yet, but if you had a chance to look at sort of the, the fundamental, rising of power dynamics that happen around literature, because literature is so powerful that it does raise questions of power and differences in power and the need to control, and the fear of something very powerful.
Yes.
How did you have a chance to look at the the politics of how politics might have also might have influenced the way some of this literature came about and how it affected history?
Yeah.
Did politics play? And the last question at the back. Just hold that answer for a second, Martin. The last question there. Could we have the next?
I actually wanted to ask about the contemporary moment, given the fact that there is a proliferation of writing in the here and now, and given the fact that you have written this marvelous history of writing, of literature, how would you understand and interpret the squeezing of the humanities?
Squeezing of the humanities and political.
The crippling of literary imagination in the institutions, in academia.
Yeah. They're both great questions. The first one, in a way, I'll come back to something I talked to a moment ago, namely that through most of its history, literature is power in some sense, because writing is controlled by very small groups of people, usually either at courts or at temples or both. And so for our idea that literature might be at a remove from power or even challenge power, I think is a relatively recent one. I have one chapter about, based on Anna Akhmatova, the poet during the Soviet Union who challenged power and was forced basically back into an oral mode because the state controlled print. And she didn't dare to even handwrite some of her poetry.
She had to memorize. She memorized her or all poetry?
But for me, one of the surprising takeaway points was just how closely through much of its history, literature and power were virtually indistinguishable. And then here and there you start to see fissures, and then you see it changing mostly over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. So that for me was the surprise. And our internet moment, to segue to the next question, and maybe we can continue the conversation afterwards. There's more to be said about the power in literature. About the internet, I mean, in some ways, I wrote this book in the middle of this revolution in how literature is written and distributed and stored and so on and so forth. So the book in some sense was an attempt to look at what happened at these earlier inflection points and draw some conclusions or gain some perspective on our own moment. And so I think that one of the big effects is that with the printing press, you have the democratization over a couple of hundred years of reading, but not necessarily of writing. There's still a lot of barriers to publishing something. And so you have relatively few authors and mass, including the large numbers of readers. In some sense, that's what comes to define authorship. What's interesting now with the internet, that anyone can become an author. So even the term or the notion of authorship is changing and becoming so expansive that it may, in some sense, no longer make sense to hold on to it in some sense. So that's, I think it's the biggest change since the printing press, the access to publishing something and becoming an author in that sense. But the humanities, I have to think more about it, to what extent it's connected to to that moment, because in some sense, of course, we live in a very technologically driven moment, and a kind of technology-driven sense of progress, and I think that militates against the humanities and sort of the historical thinking that they instill. I mean, I see that when I ask students why they're gravitating to these other subjects, but I don't have a good answer to it. I mean, I think, like many people in the humanities, I'm flummoxed by it. My own sense is also, I mean, my own response to it is to do more public-facing work. I think there's something where the academic humanities, at least, have become much too insular, which is why it's so fantastic, the work you all are doing. But that, I don't think that's the only reason, and that's maybe not the only solution. That's where I see, where maybe I can do something. But the connection of the internet and the decline of the humanities, I think that question, I'm embarrassed to say, I hadn't quite put that to myself as a question, so I'll keep thinking about it. Thank you for putting it that way.
Thank you all. Martin, thank you so much. We could have continued forever. This is, it's really a seminal piece of work, and to leave you all with a bit of thinking, 100,000 years ago, even as we went out of Africa, and in leaving Africa, or migrating from Africa, outwards into Europe and then later into Asia. In each place you found innovation. You brought new things to the places that you are. And yet today, so many millennia later, every time somebody talks about migration, you want to stop it and challenge it. So that's something that we need to think about as well in terms of the future. Martin Puchner, thank you so much. Please go and buy his book and have it signed. Suraj, back to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Martin Puchner and Sanjoy Roy.
Brilliant.
Let's hear it for them.
Thank you, that was so great.
Such a pleasure.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Sanjoy, for that really insightful conversation. Can we have a token of gratitude for our speakers?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, once again. I hope that you enjoyed the conversation. Martin will be signing the books outside, so you can buy the books and get it signed from Martin. I would quickly like to thank all our partners and supporters, the Center for Fiction, this beautiful venue for hosting us, National Arts Club, Asia Society, Sundaram Tagore Gallery, NDTV, Vedera Institute, Brooklyn, Delhi, and Ziva Foods. Our next session is The Poetic Imagination, Rhyme, Rhythm and Reason, Vijay Sheshadri, Arundhati Subramaniam and Nandana Dev Sen in conversation. So stay back for that as well. Thank you so much and see you shortly.